Hi, I'm Heather Marie Montilla, and you are watching PBS Books. Thank you for joining us. PBS Books, in collaboration with WTTW, is pleased to host a conversation with Pulitzer Prize winning author Matthew Desmond, author of Poverty by America. PBS Books is a proud partner of the Library of Congress to promote their 2023 National Book Festival. Let's take a moment to hear from the Librarian of Congress, Dr. Carla Hayden.
I'm Carla Hayden, Librarian of Congress, and I want to give a thank you to PBS Books for supporting the National Book Festival. Hope you can join us in Washington and online for this year's festival on Saturday, August the 12th.
Well, as Dr. Carla Hayden said, the festival has already happened. It happened on August 12th earlier this month, but do not fear. The festival is still able to be accessed to everyone. So go to loc.gov/bookfest. And over the last week, everyone at the library has been working to prepare all of the festival conversations to be available to all of you. It represents the voices of 80 outstanding authors, and it is just a wonderful resource to be able to curate your own experience. Well, now through August 31st, PBS Books and PBS stations across the country host a series of 10 virtual events with 11 authors. They are also available on demand on PBS Books and at the National Book Festival website. Let's take a moment to hear from my friend and colleague, WTTW's Tim Russell.
Hello, I'm Tim Russell, Vice President, Community Engagement and Diversity, Equity, Inclusion for WTTW and WFMT. WTTW is committed to producing and presenting trusted, best-in-class content fueled by distinctly Chicago sensibility. We have served as Chicago's window to the world, and our purpose is to enrich lives, engage communities, and inspire exploration. I am so thrilled to be here to talk about the importance of this event for PBS. I not only want to welcome the Chicago community for joining us today, but also welcome viewers nationwide. I am honored to be part of this event that gives all viewers an inside look into the thoughts and ideas of some of the most renowned authors. Our programming and content across all our platforms express this purpose. And today's event with PBS Books and the Library of Congress National Book Festival is the perfect example of WTTW bringing its purpose to life. WTTW is proud to partner with PBS Books in this interview with Matthew Desmond. Like Matthew, WTTW explored intergenerational poverty in Chicago through our Firsthand Living in Poverty series. For an entire year, we focused on the firsthand perspectives of people facing this critical issue. In Firsthand Living with Poverty, WTTW presents a documented series, reported text stories, expert talks, and community discussions with a supporting discussion guide, all of which can be found on WTTW.com/firsthand. Today's author talk is critically important as we attempt to emerge from the economic uncertainties of the pandemic. Conversations such as this is important for shedding light on the issues that impact our society. Once again, thank you PBS Books for your partnership, and thank you all, and I hope you enjoy today's discussion.
Well, thanks, Tim. We are so proud to be able to partner with WTTW on this important conversation. Well, today's event features Matthew Desmond to discuss his work and involvement in the festival. His latest book, Poverty by America, reimagines the debate on poverty and draws on history, research, and original reporting to show how affluent Americans knowingly and sometimes unknowingly keep poor people poor. Well, let's meet Matthew Desmond. He is the Maurice P. Doering Professor of Sociology at Princeton University and the founding director of the Eviction Lab, a lab that studies housing insecurity and evictions in the United States. His previous book, Evicted Poverty and Profit in the American City, won a Pulitzer Prize, a National Book Critics Circle Award, and a PEN Award, among others. The recipient of a MacArthur Fellowship, Desmond is also a contributing writer for the New York Times Magazine. His latest book, Poverty by America, will be featured at the 2023 National Book Festival. It is my extraordinary honor to welcome Matthew.
Hey, Heather Marie, thanks for having me.
It's so great to have you here. Your book it's outstanding. It's filled with statistics and stories and personal experiences and observations. It really helps to bring crucial understanding to the extraordinary challenge of poverty in the US. It raises its awareness and also provides a call to action. In your own words, can you summarize your book for all of us?
Sure. So the novelist Tommy Orange has this line in his book, There, where he writes, it's like these kids are jumping out of the windows of burning buildings, falling to their deaths. And we think that the problem is they're jumping. And when I read that line, I was like, man, that's the American poverty debate. For over 100 years, we've focused on the poor themselves, the jumpers in a way. And we should have been focused on the fire. Who lit it? Who's warming their hands by it? And this book is about the fire. It's about why there's so much poverty in this land of dollars and how we can finally end it.
Thank you. Your book that came before this that we've discussed, Evicted, how did that work inspire or relate to this book? And were your approaches similar or different?
So when I reported out Evicted, I lived in two very poor neighborhoods in Milwaukee. I moved into a mobile home park and lived there for about 5 months. And then I moved into a rooming house on the north side of the city and lived there for about 10 months. And from those two neighborhoods followed families getting evicted. And I went everywhere with those families. I followed them in eviction court and abandoned homes and shelters and slept on their floor and ate from their table, watched their kids, went to a bunch of funerals with them, went to a birth. And I was exposed to a kind of poverty that I had never seen before in America. I grew up poor in Arizona, but this was something of a whole other level. I met grandmas living without heat in the wintertime, buried under blankets and praying that the space heaters didn't go out. I was on this eviction move once with the sheriffs, and we knocked on a door, and young kid opened the door. Maybe she was 12, 13, and we went in to do the eviction, the sheriffs did, and there was just kids living in the house. There was no adult. The mom had died, and the kids had just gone on living in there until the landlord had had enough. And they evicted the kids, and they put their stuff out on the curb and changed the locks, and someone called social services, and they were off to the next eviction. And I think seeing those kinds of scenes really drove this question of why inside of me. And then something else happened too in Milwaukee, which is, the mobile home park I was living in, the landlord, gave me access to his books, his rental books, so I could calculate his profit. And by my calculations, the landlord of the poorest trailer park in a very poor city at the time, he was making over $400,000 after expenses. And, his tenants were collecting cans to get by and living on disability. And that made me think, whoa, that's a kind of direct inequality. His gains are their losses often that we needed to confront in a real way. And I think that really drove some of the questions here in poverty. And it is a different reported book, right? Evicted is in the spirit of bearing witness. And it's about looking at the human cost of the housing crisis. But Poverty by America is a book about how the other half lives, right? It is a book about how many of us profit from poverty. And that required a different kind of writing and a different kind of register than Evicted was.
Your new book, it tackles societal, systematic, structural, and institutional issues that really perpetuate poverty at large. How can there be so much poverty here in the richest country in the world? And shouldn't we all be shamed for it on some level? I mean, I think 12% of Americans live in poverty. Is that correct? 30 million people. I mean, it's extraordinary numbers. What do you think? I mean, obviously, that's what your book is, but how are we at this moment?
So you're right. You know, this is the richest country with the worst poverty. There's about 38 million Americans that live below the official poverty line. If those Americans formed a country, that country would have a bigger population than Australia or Venezuela. Um, but there's a ton of poverty above the poverty line in a way, in a lived experience. 1 in 3 Americans lives in a home making $55,000 or less. Many aren't officially considered poor, but what else do you call trying to raise a couple kids in Portland or Miami or Chicago on 55K, you know? And there's just hard bottom layer of poverty in America too. You know, by some estimates, 5 million of us are getting by on $4 a day or less. Abject poverty by global standards. So why? And this is a choice. This is a choice that the country has made. The biggest myth about poverty in America is that it's inevitable, that we have to live with it. It's not. We have doubled the child poverty rate of South Korea, Germany, and many of our peer nations. So why are we falling so far behind? And the answer is because a lot of us profit from it. There's so much poverty in America, not in spite of our wealth, but because of it. Many of us consume the cheap goods and services the working poor produce. Many of us are invested in the stock market. Don't we benefit when we see our returns going up, even when those returns cost workers something in terms of poor wages? The United States has an incredibly imbalanced welfare state. You know, we give the most to families that need it the least, especially in the form of tax breaks. And then we have the audacity to say that we can't afford to do more. So we do a lot more to subsidize affluence in America than to fight poverty. And then finally, the country is still segregated. And many of us continue to build walls around our communities to hoard opportunities behind those walls. And that creates neighborhoods of concentrated opulence, but also neighborhoods of concentrated poverty, the side effect of that opportunity hoarding. And so, yeah, you know, this is not just about policy and structure. It's often about us too, and the recognition that we're connected to the problem and connected to the solution.
All right, so you said a lot there. You said tax breaks, right? Tax breaks for this country's poorest families often seem to be a controversial topic, right? It's one of those things that you hear, and there are people who think it's not fair. But the reality of tax breaks is something very different. Can you discuss that? And also, you alluded to it a little bit. There's been a lack of progress on fighting poverty or addressing poverty since the 1970s.
All right. So a lot of times people will say, you know, poor folks, they don't have to pay any taxes. And that's because the federal income tax has a standard deduction. And if you fall below a certain income level, you don't really pay a federal income tax. But thinking about tax burden by only looking at federal income tax is like counting calories by only counting breakfast. You know, there's a lot of ways we're taxed. There's sales tax, there's insurance tax. And so if you add up all the taxes that are levied on the American people, you come to a pretty surprising conclusion that basically we have kind of a flat tax in America in reality. And low income folks pay just as much of their income to taxes as middle and even upper income folks. The richest Americans actually have the lowest tax rate in America. And so I think that the tax debate is often muddled and wrong. It's also the case that a lot of us have a hard time seeing a tax break as something that's akin to like a housing stipend, for example, or food stamps. But let's think about it. You know, both a welfare check and a housing tax break cost the government money, for example. They both put money in our pockets, and they both incentivize certain behavior. And so if we get the mortgage interest deduction, for example, we could get that by deducting it come tax time, or the government could issue us a check. It's the same difference. And so by my calculation, if you add up everything the government does for families, means tested programs like food stamps, housing assistance, social insurance, things like Social Security, and tax breaks, you learn that the average family in the bottom 20% of the income distribution, our poorest families, they get about $26,000 a year from the government. But the average family in the top 20%, our richest families, they get about $35,000 a year from the government. That's almost a 40% difference. That's what I'm talking about when we're talking about this unbalanced, unequal welfare state and how we do a lot more to guard fortunes than to fight poverty.
You know, it's interesting because you're a sociologist, but you are talking to me like an economist and a policy person. So how did that happen? How right? Or is that sociology? Is that true sociology? How are you, you're able to bring in all of these other factors, because what we're talking about is, of course, society and people, but you are taking a very different look at it than we often hear from sociologists.
Yeah, I mean, I'll pull whatever tool out of the toolbox I can, and if it's in econ, I'll draw on that. If it's in literature or poetry, I'll draw on that. I think that sociology brings a unique focus to this problem, which is a focus on power and exploitation, and the fact that there are winners and losers in America, and sometimes there are losers because there are winners, and I think that perspective is one that sociology takes incredibly seriously. The book makes an argument that exploitation in the labor market, the housing market, and the financial market, that's a main driver of poverty in America. And exploitation is kind of a scary, charged word, but it just means when you don't have a lot of choice, you kind of have to take the best bad option. And we've all been in this situation. You're just stuck and you got to pay for it. And that kind of situation really defines the lives of the American poor. Let's look at just financial exploitation. So every year, banks charge $11 billion in overdraft fees. $1.5 billion in check cashing fees is levied on the poor. Almost $10 billion in payday loan fees. That's like $61 million just in fines and fees pulled out of the pockets of the poor every single day. So when James Baldwin famously remarked like how expensive it is to be poor in America, he couldn't have imagined these receipts. That kind of exploitation matters so much to the lives of the poor. And that kind of exploitation is something that often benefits us. Many of us have free checking accounts, but it turns out they're not free. They're subsidized by massive levies and fines that are issued to basically 9% of bank users. The poor made to pay for their poverty.
Well, there's a lot in there. When we think about exploitation, one of the things obviously is workers, right? And how Americans are able to get what they get at the price they get it. Let's discuss American workers and how you have a chapter even on how they are undercut. And so if we can think about how that a group of workers, right, how they can't even afford basic necessities. Can you discuss basically the role in unions, where that's going, and also just overall the deterioration of American jobs?
So a few years ago, I met a young man named Julio Payez. He was working 2 jobs for minimum wage, living in California. He started his shift at McDonald's, working 10 p.m. to 6 a.m. Then he'd have 2 hours to rest and shower. And then he clocked in on a second job, Aerotech, going anywhere the temp service sent him between 8 a.m. and 4 p.m. And he rested and showered as much as he could. And then it was back to McDonald's. But he had to put in those hours to afford the low cost apartment in the Bay Area for his mom and his younger brother. And one day his younger brother went up to Julio and was like, "Hey, I'm saving up my money, man." And he's like, "Yeah, why?" And he said, "Well, I want to buy an hour of your time. How much for an hour to play with me?" And Julio heard that. He just wept. And not long after, he collapsed in the aisle of a grocery store from just sheer exhaustion. He was 24 years old. That's the situation for a lot of American workers today. But it hasn't always been like that. In the 1960s, 1970s, 1 in 3 workers belonged to a union. It was the most economically equitable time in our country. Incomes climbed, CEO pay was reined in. But as workers lost power because unions were kind of destabilized and undercut, their jobs got a lot worse. One sociologist put it like this, like our grandparents had careers and our parents had jobs and we complete tasks. And I think that's a pretty efficient way to describe the story of the American working class and working poor. If you're a man today without a college degree, your wages are less in real terms and inflation adjusted terms. They are less than they were 50 years ago. This is a big part of the story, right? Because like when the War on Poverty and Great Society were launched in 1964, these things that did things like expand food aid, expand Social Security, these were deep investments in poor families in America. But they were also investments that were rolled out during a time when unions were strong and the job market was delivering for American workers. But as unions lost power, the job market is not pulling its weight, and it's kind of turning anti-poverty programs into something like dialysis. They're essential, they're effective, but they can't fight poverty with their, one hand tied behind their back, so to speak. That's why we have to address exploitation if we're going to get serious about ending poverty in this country.
You wrote, corporate profits rise when labor costs fall. And obviously we know, right, when corporations get lots of money, more money, right, when the labor cost decreases, that's just economics. But whose fault is this? Is it the lawmakers, lobbyists? Is it the corporation? Is it the consumer or the shareholder? If you were to assign blame, who is most to blame that we're at this moment?
Yeah, I think my answer is yes. I think my answer is yes. And it's true that those who have amassed the most power in politics and in the economy, they do bear the most responsibility. That's a true statement and like deliciously absolving, right? We can always point the finger at the guy that's richer than us, the corporation that's more powerful than us, the politician that has the votes. And but like I just feel so tired of absolving theories of poverty. And I do not think we're going to be able to build the political will that puts upward pressure on corporate and political elites if we don't have skin in the game. If we don't say, man, I'm shopping according to my environmental values. I'm shopping local. I do organic, but I don't know how much the farm worker got paid by picking my local organic cucumber. I know what shoes to buy or what coffee to drink to signal I'm this kind of American. I'm this politically oriented, but I have no idea what the folks in those coffee baristas are making or the shoe factories making. So I think that we do need to express a commitment to economic justice in consumer choices and investment decisions. And I think that if I do that and you do that, that might be a lifestyle thing, but that's not going to make a big dent. But think if we did that by the thousands and the tens of thousands, I think that could really matter. We've seen consumer activism move the dial on other issues. Why can't we have it move the dial on ending poverty?
Okay, so I have a question about this. Personal experience. Post-COVID, I see more and more signs, at least around where I live, the wage that they're offering is, up to $20 an hour, even up to $22 an hour at grocery stores. What I've also personally noticed is that what I'm spending on a grocery bill is probably 25 to 30% more than I used to spend. And so one of the things I can't help but think is that while these wages for the working poor might be increasing, basic necessities have increased so much that wage, the increase is, I don't want to say useless, because obviously we want everyone to have a fair and living wage, but it's almost defeating on some level. Is there anything, can you respond?
Yeah, so I hear two questions. One question is, look, if we increase wages or we increase incomes, is that enough? And my answer is no, it's not enough. And it's because the housing market often catches up to those gains. There's studies that show when cities raise the minimum wage, that really helps renters make rent for a while. And then the housing market slowly kind of catches up to those income gains and dilutes the effect of the policy. So if we want to get serious about ending poverty in America, we have to think about increasing wages and incomes, but we also have to think about ending housing exploitation, expanding choice along those kind of things. But then I also heard a question about inflation. And I think that there's been a lot of intellectual capture, I think, about inflation since COVID. And America often kind of talks about itself like it exists in a bubble in a way. Like if we deepen our investments in the American people, do we have to just hit inflation? Is inflation the cost of that investment? But like you just look overseas, you can find countries that are making much deeper investments in the public, and they do not, face inflation all the time as like a lived experience. The inflation debate is still ongoing. It's pretty complicated, but I'm very interested in a growing body of evidence that kind of really points to the importance of corporate profits here, actually, and what economists call markups. And so a study out of the Kansas City Fed showed that like before COVID, labor costs really were the biggest driving force for inflationary pressure. But after COVID, corporate profits were. If corporations were well positioned in the market, they could take advantage of that and really increase cost, which means the federal government should think about policies that address that and not just policies that, make poor workers take the hard medicine. But I heard another question, and I heard a question about inflation. And, there was this kind of running story that the inflationary crisis that we saw post COVID was due to big investments in the American people, things like the COVID rescue aid, emergency rental assistance, the child tax credit. These were really, really powerful, historic policies. I mean, we cut child poverty by 46% in 6 months. We drove evictions down to the lowest on record ever. And so, but do we have to just eat all this inflation because of that? And I think the record is really mixed on this. I think there is evidence that a lot of the inflationary pressure is driven by corporate markups and corporate profits. And I think that just you can look at other countries that make deeper investments in the public and in anti-poverty programs, and they don't live with inflation on a routine basis. And so I think that we should be just hesitant to accept kind of the normal story about inflation as something that you have, like a consequence you have to deal with if you make these deep investments. I think that the story is a bit more complicated, and I think we absolutely can deepen our investments in fighting poverty without facing inflationary pressure like we've faced post-COVID.
Thank you for that answer. Well, for those of you out there just joining us, I'm Heather Marie Montilla. You're watching PBS Books. It's my pleasure to be here celebrating the 2023 Library of Congress National Book Festival. I am here with Matthew Desmond, and we are discussing his latest book, Poverty by America. Back to the conversation. All right, so we have been talking about all sorts of things. One theme that's been coming throughout, which should be no surprise because you obviously won a Pulitzer Prize for Evicted, is housing, right? This critical role of the cost of housing, especially when we know that rents, the rental cost increases, and often those costs outpace operating costs, especially in low income or high crime communities. What moral obligation do you think the government has to ensure that this injustice does not happen as we think back to our founding documents as a country, right? PBS Books, we've been struggling or thinking, challenging ourselves to think about, America 250 celebration is coming in 3 years. Let's think about our founding documents. What is every American promise? Well, we know we weren't the best on all men are created equal, but we're still working. But that is part of this problem and part of this conversation. But I would argue, as we think of promising people, right, among other things, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, without basic necessities, how can you have happiness? So I know you talk a lot about this in your book. You say poverty is diminished life and personhood, and you're talking also about the mental health, the state of mental health. Can you talk about kind of this irony or it's a tragedy, right? That we've promised one thing and as a nation, we're delivering something else.
Yeah. I feel like you should keep going, Heather. I mean, I feel like there was some power. Preach it. Look, I think that if we want to get serious about freedom,
Yeah.
if we want to get serious about economic opportunity, if we really are a nation of economic opportunity, we can't abide what we've created, what we've allowed ourselves to become. And I think there is a moral obligation uh, from the highest echelons of political power to protect and support its people. And everyone needs decent, affordable housing because without stable shelter, everything else falls apart. No one in America should fall into destitution and poverty. No one, with no qualifications, that no one should fall below a certain level where your life is threatened, your health is threatened, where you just you can't afford the most basic of basic necessities. But millions of us do. That's our situation here. And so I think that it, but I also think that we, us, you, me, also have a moral obligation to folks in our community. Um, we are embroiled in all these morally compromised situations and relationships. And I think even those of us who are the most privileged in America, you know, are diminished by all this poverty in our midst. And, the end of poverty in America doesn't mean a perfect country, but it does mean a freer, safer, healthier country. I think a lot of us are pining for that in a way.
Public housing, some situations it's failed. I mean, I'm from New York City, and the places, right? Public housing is very dangerous. There are different, not all, but some. But there are some success stories, and you talk about those success stories within your book a little bit. And you even, and separate from that, you talk about the Stockton, California experiment. And I was hoping you could we've been talking about what's not going right, but let's talk about some of the things that are going right.
Yeah, so public housing is often remembered as this colossal public policy failure, right? We built these giant Soviet-looking towers in segregated communities in Chicago and Atlanta and St. Louis, and then we defunded them. President Reagan cut HUD's budget by 70%, almost 70%. If you defund anything like that, that's a real recipe for failure. On top of this just kind of cruel way that we segregated the poor through public housing, and so these buildings fell into disrepair and they became so bad. It was kind of like dynamiting them was a kindness, it felt, to many people. But it wasn't the idea of public housing in and of itself that failed. It was our execution. And like anyone that doesn't believe in the power of public housing anymore should just visit like these amazing, beautiful public housing complexes that are springing up all across the country. I think Washington, D.C. has public housing in basically every community in the city. It blends into the community. It's low slung. It's awesome. It's beautiful. It's prideful and pride-inducing. And the research backs this up. Kids that grow up in public housing, they do a lot better actually later on in life than their cousins or their friends that are exposed to the private rental market. Most poor renting families today, below the poverty line, most poor renting families today spend at least half of their income on housing cost, and about 1 in 4 spend over 70% just on rent and utilities. Public housing is a buffer to that. It's a life changer. It's really moving to be with someone when they finally receive a housing voucher after like years and years and years on the waiting list. And what they do when they finally receive that ticket, studies show, is that they use their freed up income to take it to the grocery store and buy more food. Their kids become stronger, less anemic. It works. We just need more of it. We need to dose the problem in a more serious way.
So we're talking a little bit about policies, and when we think about the assistance that the poor are given in this country by the government, I want to think a little bit about the policies that help create some of those things. And I'm not a researcher, but I'm going to give some stories. One is I've been part of a few conversations where someone needs more people to work at their workplace, but if their workers work more, they earn overtime. When they get overtime, they earn more. And in fact, they'll lose their government support.
Right.
Similarly, this is not a surprising story, but people who live in public housing, often their rent is adjusted as they earn more. So in fact, there was someone I knew who earned more. They got a raise at work. They ended up paying more rent and basically receiving less income because the increase was more than their increase in their paycheck.
Right.
And all of this provides disincentives for people who are trying to get out of poverty, right? And so my question is kind of, you've done a lot of research here. Why? Why do you think? Because all of the writing is on the wall that the policies are set up to keep people in a place. Because if not, like one of the thoughts is, well, why can't they save money? Instead of taking that extra money out of their paycheck and having it go to rent, why can't it go in a savings account to save money to be able to move out on their own when they're ready, right? There's lots of different, I'm an MPA, but I'm not a PhD, and there are lots of really smart people in this country. We have an amazing brain trust. You've done amazing work. Why are we here, and how can we solve it?
Yeah, we're here for a lot of different reasons, and often it's not nefarious. Often it's kind of bureaucratic culture. It's butt covering. It is, bureaucrats being incentivized when they follow the rules and comply instead of when they deliver, in a way, or innovate. And so, that can clog up the system and make it very user friendly. But this thing, especially this benefit cliff is what we call it in the policy world. It's really dangerous and damaging. It divides the poor from the working class, where there's a lot of folks that are just struggling and they're like, why does this person have access to a housing assistance? When I can't access that and I can't afford a mortgage, I'm out in the cold. And I think that the way we've devised some of these anti-poverty programs to make them most efficient has been very divisive. And we do not have to choose in this rich country between these. We don't have to design our policies like this, I should say. We have enough resources to kind of design bigger tent policies, for example, policies that are, inclusive and broad. You brought up Stockton a few moments ago, and former Mayor Michael Tubbs had a really played a real leadership role in the country by getting behind guaranteed basic income. And, in COVID, we had guaranteed basic income experiment. Actually, it was just called the child tax credit. It was checks that went out to moderate income families, low income families. I think it was passed in March. Checks started flying out in June. Fast, efficient, got to a lot of families, massively reduced the poverty rate, but also benefited a lot of working class and middle class families too. And I think those kind of policies are really impactful and things that we should get behind. And then the question is, like, can we afford those? Can we afford to keep doing more? And I just feel like we have to push back against that scarcity mindset and scarcity division. We have so many resources here. A study published recently showed that if the top 1% of us just paid the taxes they owed, like not paid more taxes, just stopped evading taxes so successfully, we as a nation could raise an additional $175 billion a year. That's more than enough to reestablish that child tax credit that did so much to help families during the pandemic. That's almost enough to lift everyone above the official poverty line. So we can do more. We have the resources, and we don't have to fight for crumbs.
Okay, so this is a solution, right? And this is what I love about your book. It not only clearly outlines the problems, gives you personal stories, right? But also you're outlining solutions. So can you go over, you say investing in more anti-poverty programs, stopping the exploitation of low-income workers, and embracing the idea that, and I love this one, that everyone can prosper. Can you kind of go over and describe some of those solutions and how, I know you even have a great website, like how can we participate in this solution as an American citizen to make this country a better place and a place that fulfills what our founding documents stated?
Okay. So we used to, as a country, have ambitions to end poverty, right? When the Johnson administration launched the war on poverty in 1964, they set a deadline. They were like, we got this by 1976, And, it wasn't just talk. They set a deadline. And I think that we can rekindle that moral energy and that ambition and audacity, in a way, that the bombasticness of that today. And we need to do three things to end poverty. We need to deepen our investments in fighting poverty. And we can fund those investments by fair tax implementation. But we don't just need deeper investments, we need different ones. We need policies that disrupt poverty, that cut it at its root. And this means we have to build worker power to increase wages. We have to expand housing choice so that poor families don't have to just take the best bad option in the rental market. And we need to end the unrelenting exploitation of the poor in the financial sector. And then we have to finally turn away from segregation. We have to fight for broad, inclusive communities. We have to tear down our walls. And that's how we can end poverty in America. And that's just not on them, whoever them is, Congress or the mayor or the other party. This is something that we can do today. So here's five concrete things that you can do and I can do today to start fighting poverty, to become a poverty abolitionist. We can shop and invest differently. We can kind of vote with our wallets in a way. Second, we can flex our influence where we are. So I teach at a university. I should be asking, what's my university doing to take care of its landscapers? How are we treating them? How are we treating our adjunct faculty? What is our endowment invested in? I've got a little influence here. I can flex it. And we all have that in our faith community, in our neighborhood, in our families. Let's start where we are. Third, let's talk about taxes differently. Everyone in America, right, left, center, we just complain about taxes. We need to start disrupting that. And we need to start talking about public investments and the fact that so many of us get benefits that don't make a lot of sense, actually. And we should lose sleep over this when there's so much poverty in this country. The fourth thing that we can do is fight segregation. Segregation is a result of history and laws, but it's also a result of a lot of people doing the hard work of defending the wall. They go to the zoning board meetings, they yell at the alderman, and those of us seeking a different kind of community, we need to go to those meetings too. And we need to stand up and say, look, this community's long-standing tradition of segregation ends with me. I want this building in my neighborhood. I do not want to deny other kids opportunities my kids get living here. Build this thing. And fifth, we can join the anti-poverty movement. And there's these amazing movements all over the country working at the state and federal level. And if you're interested in this, there's a website that I've built called endpovertyusa.org. It's just endpovertyusa.org. It does two simple things. It's designed to connect families to services in their communities that they need and deserve. And it's designed to connect all of us to groups just putting in the work at the federal level or in your state fighting poverty right now.
Well, this has been a great conversation. I can't wait to hopefully be able to continue the conversation with you, as I know you will be writing more, you will be advocating more. But let's talk about the Library of Congress National Book Festival. So earlier this month you went. Was this your first time? Was it fun?
It was my first time. It was fun and inspiring. And I mean, a book festival is a very special thing. You're connecting with readers that might not come to your book talks, right, normally, that maybe they're there for George Saunders and Warren Dodin or vice, and I think that, that's very exciting. That gets you different audiences, different questions, different energy. And it's just wonderful to celebrate books of all kinds, with a festival like this. So it was great to be there, great to be invited.
Well, thank you so much. And thank you for this conversation. It's really been wonderful. I know everyone out there, if you haven't yet picked up the book, I recommend you do. It will not be a disappointment. And if let's say you're like, oh, it's a big book. The good news is, and I have a friend who taught me this trick. He said, you know, sometimes when I pick up big books, and this isn't a very big book, but he was like, I always put a bookmark at the end notes. And the amazing thing, because I love back matter, I like to read the end notes because I like to know all of where authors are getting the information. But the end notes take up, I want to say it's like over 100 pages. So for those of you who are, it's really, you will get a lot from the whole book, but 200 pages, and you are going to learn so very much about poverty in America, but Poverty by America, that's the book. So until next time, we are going to close the show. And I just want to thank you for your brilliance, for your research, your thoughtfulness, for delving into this really important topic and helping to make us better Americans. So thank you so much, Matthew.
It was really wonderful conversation. Thank you so much for having me, and thank you for being such a enthusiastic ambassador for books and ideas. And so really appreciated this conversation.
Well, thank you. For those of you out there, I just want to remind you, all of the content is still available at the Library of Congress National Book Festival website. You can go to loc.gov/bookfest. Now until August 31st, there are still a few more new conversations, but all of that content can also be gotten at the PBS Books website or at the Library of Congress National Book Festival website. Until next time, I'm Heather Marie Montilla, and happy reading.